The day my father-in-law looked me in the eye across a conference table and said, "You never really belonged in this family anyway." I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I folded my hands in my lap, pressed my thumbnail into my palm until I felt something sharp and real, and I smiled at him. That smile cost me everything I had left. My name is Sutton. I was 26 when I married into the Whitfield family, and I want to be honest with you right from the start. I knew they didn't like me. I knew it the way you know a storm is coming before the clouds roll in. Something in the air shifts, and your body registers it before your brain catches up. My mother-in-law, Claudette, had a way of looking at me like I was a smudge on an otherwise clean window. My father-in-law, Boyd, shook my hand at our wedding reception and said, "Well, you got what you wanted." And my husband just laughed and said, "Dad, come on," and moved us toward the cake table. I told myself it didn't matter. I loved Reeve. That was supposed to be enough. Reeve Whitfield was a good man. I want to say that clearly, because this story gets complicated, and I don't want you to think I've rewritten him in my memory the way grief sometimes lets you do. He was genuinely good, patient in the way of someone who had practiced it, funny in the quiet way that surprises you, the kind of person who remembered what you'd said you were worried about 2 weeks ago and asked about it without prompting. He was an engineer at a civil infrastructure firm in Charlotte. I was a paralegal at a mid-sized firm downtown. We met at a continuing education seminar that neither of us wanted to attend. He spilled coffee on my folder. I said something sarcastic. He laughed instead of apologizing, and I thought, okay, this one. We were married for 4 years before the accident. It was February. Black ice on I-485, a semi that jackknifed in the left lane, and Reeve's truck. He always drove too fast in winter. I'd said it 100 times. I said it the morning of the day he died. Didn't have time to stop. He was 41 years old. He was on his way home from a site visit. He had texted me 20 minutes before it happened asking if I wanted Thai or pizza. I still have that text. The grief was its own country, and I lived there for a long time. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have prepared for, was that the Whitfields were going to use my grief as a door. Reeve didn't have a will. He was 41. We kept meaning to. It's the thing everyone says they'll get to, and then life is full and busy, and you think you have more time than you do. North Carolina intestate law meant that without a will, his estate, our home, his savings, his 401(n), a small investment account he'd opened years before we met, would be split between his spouse and his parents since we had no children. I'd known this vaguely, in the way you know things you hope never to need. I didn't know Boyd Whitfield had known it too, much more specifically, for much longer. The first thing they did was contest the house. Our home was a 3-bedroom Craftsman in Plaza Midwood that Reeve and I had bought together in 2019. We'd split the down payment. I'd used my entire savings, $28,000, every dollar I'd accumulated since my first job at 18, and we'd been paying the mortgage together ever since. But Reeve's name was the only one on the deed. We'd meant to add mine. We kept meaning to. Boyd hired a probate attorney within 3 weeks of the funeral. I found out the way you find out about things like that, a certified letter on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in my car outside the grocery store, because I couldn't make myself go in and choose between brands of soup. The envelope was from a law firm I didn't recognize. I sat there in the parking lot reading it 3 times before it started to make sense. Boyd was petitioning to have Reeve's estate assessed in full. He was claiming the house as a primary asset subject to division. He was claiming Reeve's personal savings account, the one I had co-signed authority on but hadn't technically co-owned, was separate property. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the letter in the footwell. I called my sister Fern from the parking lot. She listened without interrupting, which is the thing Fern does when she knows something is serious. When I finished, she said, "Sutton, listen to me. You need a lawyer, not tomorrow, today." Fern is 8 years older than me. She raised me after our mother got sick, mostly. She worked double shifts at a hospital laundry room to make sure I had lunch money and school supplies. And she has never once in her life let me see her cry. And when she told me I needed a lawyer, I went and got one. Her name was Patricia. No, wait, the attorney I hired. Her name was Vera Odom. She was 50-something, silver hair, the kind of woman who sets her coffee cup down with precise deliberateness that lets you know she is always thinking 3 steps ahead. She listened to everything I told her, asked me questions I didn't know how to answer at first, and then she sat back in her chair and said, "Sutton, this is winnable. But it's going to get worse before it gets better. Are you prepared for that?" I said yes. I didn't know what I was agreeing to. What I didn't know was that Boyd had been talking to Claudette's brother, a man named Harlan who ran a small real estate holding company in Mecklenburg County, about the house. I found out later, much later, that they had already drafted a plan to have the house appraised, bought out my potential claim for a fraction of its value, and resold it within 6 months. I didn't know they'd already had a conversation with Reeves Bank about the accounts. I didn't know that Claudette, at the reception after the funeral, while I was in the kitchen cutting pie because I had to do something with my hands, had gone through the office Reeve, and I shared and taken a folder of financial documents. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that my father-in-law was trying to take my house. The months that followed are hard to describe without sounding like I'm performing for sympathy, and I don't want to do that. I'll just tell you what it was like on the inside. I went to work every day. I answered emails. I filed motions and pulled case law and ate lunch at my desk and said, "I'm doing okay," when people asked how I was doing. And then I went home to a house that felt like it had been hollowed out, and I sat on the kitchen floor sometimes. Not on purpose. I just didn't always make it to a chair, and I held myself together by reminding myself that falling apart was a thing I could not afford. Boyd had resources I didn't have. That was the blunt reality. The Whitfields weren't wealthy by Charlotte standards, but Boyd had been in commercial real estate for 30 years, and he had connections, and he had Harlan, and he had a firm on retainer that had been doing estate work since before I was born. Vera was good, but she was one person, and I was paying her by the hour out of savings that were already strained. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in March. Mecklenburg County Probate Court, 2nd floor, 9 in the morning. I was not sleeping well. I had lost about 12 pounds since February that I hadn't had to lose. Fern had driven up from Columbia the week before and stood in my kitchen with her arms crossed, looking at me with the expression she uses when she is scared, but doesn't want me to know it, and made me eat an actual dinner, sitting down at the table. I cried a little. She didn't. She rubbed my back and said, "You're going to walk into that room like you belong there because you do." I thought about that a lot in the days before the hearing. What I had not told Fern, what I had not told anyone except Vera, was what I'd found. 3 weeks after that certified letter in the parking lot, I'd been going through Reeves' home office. Not looking for anything this specific, just sitting in the space where he used to be, which is something grief makes you do. His desk was the way he'd left it. Engineering notebooks stacked on the left, a coffee mug from his college that he'd used as a pen holder for as long as I'd known him, a framed photo of the two of us at the Outer Banks that I'd given him for his birthday 2 years before. Under the desk blotter, I found an envelope. It wasn't sealed. It was just folded, the flap tucked in the way you do when you're in a hurry. My name was written on the front in Reeves' handwriting, not my full name, just Sutton, in his cramped, leftward slanting engineer's print that I would recognize anywhere. Inside was a letter, dated 4 months before he died, and a USB drive. I won't tell you every word of the letter. Some of it is mine to keep. But the part that matters, the part that changed everything, was this. Reeve had known his father was going to do something like this. He didn't know exactly what. But he'd seen Boyd's behavior around money his whole life. The way Boyd categorized people by what they could take from them. And he knew his father well enough to know that if something happened to Reeve, Boyd would see it as an opportunity. He'd been documenting. The USB drive contained 3 years of files, financial records, emails, a recorded phone conversation between Boyd and Harlan from 14 months prior in which Boyd discussed, in specific terms, how he planned to handle Reeve's assets when the time came. There were property records showing that Boyd had already filed a preliminary lien inquiry on our home's address before Reeve died. There were emails from Boyd to the bank where Reeve held his personal savings account, asking questions about the account structure and beneficiary designations that he had no business asking. Boyd had been planning this while Reeve was alive. I sat on the floor of that office for a very long time. I called Vera. She told me not to touch anything and to bring her the drive in the morning. I brought her the drive in the morning. She looked at the contents for 2 days and then called me and said, in the most controlled voice I had ever heard her use, Sutton, I need you to trust me completely for the next 3 weeks. I trusted her completely for the next 3 weeks. In that time, Vera did 3 things. She contacted the IRS with documentation suggesting Boyd had been misrepresenting asset transfers through Harlan's real estate company for tax purposes, a separate issue, but one that would have significant bearing on Boyd's credibility in any financial proceeding. She obtained a forensic accounting consultation on the recorded phone call and the preliminary lien inquiry, establishing a timeline of premeditation, and she reached out to a contact at the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation with the recorded call, because that call, depending on its contents, potentially constituted conspiracy to commit financial fraud. She told me none of this until 2 days before the hearing. Not because she didn't trust me, she said, but because she needed me to be able to walk into that room without knowing what was about to happen. She needed me to look like someone who wasn't holding anything. Can you do that? She asked. I thought about Reeve's handwriting on that envelope. Just Sutton. Like he was handing something to me across whatever distance there is between here and wherever he went. Yes, I said. The morning of the hearing, I wore a gray blazer I'd bought for job interviews years ago that I'd never actually worn to an interview. Things had worked out differently, and I drove myself to the courthouse, and I sat in the second-floor hallway on a wooden bench, and I breathed, just breathed, in and out, the way you learn to do when you've been through something that required you to learn it. Boyd arrived with his attorney and Claudette and Harlan. He didn't acknowledge me in the hallway. Claudette looked at me once, quickly, and then looked away. Harlan was on his phone. They walked past me like I was furniture. I pressed my thumbnail into my palm and I breathed. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, a judge's bench that seemed disproportionately large for the space. The judge was a woman in her 60s named the Honorable Margaret O.C. Bonsu. She had reading glasses on a chain and the air of someone who had heard every story and was not easily moved by any of them. Boyd's attorney went first. He was smooth, practiced. He laid out the case for the estate distribution with the confidence of someone who had done this exact thing many times and expected no surprises. He cited case law. He referred to Reeve's assets by account number. He explained in measured tones that the marital home had not been jointly titled, and therefore Vera stood up. She said, Your Honor, I'd like to submit a set of documents into evidence. If the court will permit, I'd also like to note that there are individuals present today who have been authorized by the appropriate agencies to take action based on what these documents contain. The room went quiet in a specific way, not the quiet of attention, the quiet of something changing. Boyd's attorney said something about procedural timing. The judge looked at the documents Vera had placed before her. She read. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked up. I'm going to need to ask everyone to remain in this room, she said. Boyd's attorney started to object. The judge looked at him once. He stopped. What happened next? I've tried to find the right way to describe it, and I keep falling short. The door at the back of the hearing room opened. Two individuals from the SBI's Financial Crimes Unit came in plain clothes with credentials. There were also two Charlotte Mecklenburg detectives, and there was a woman I had never seen before. Compact, dark suit, a kind of stillness that people who are very good at their job sometimes have, who walked to the center of the room and identified herself to the judge, and then turned and looked at Boyd. Boyd was already pale. Harlan had put his phone down. The woman said Boyd's full name and identified the charges: conspiracy to commit financial fraud, filing false liens, and violations related to the misrepresentation of assets in a probate proceeding. And she said that he was not arrested in that moment, but that a formal warrant had been issued and that he would need to accompany them. Boyd looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the documents. Claudette put her hand over her mouth. Boyd looked at me. I had promised myself I would not react. I had held that promise through 8 months of losing everything and not losing everything, and not knowing which, and going to work and eating dinner sitting down, because Fern told me to, and pressing my thumbnail into my palm to find the edge of something real. I held it. I looked at him evenly. I did not smile. I didn't need to. He looked away first. The hearing was continued pending the legal proceedings, which sounds administrative and small for what it actually meant, which was Boyd's attempt to take my home and Reeves' accounts collapsed entirely in that room. The lien inquiry he had filed was invalidated. The preliminary asset claims were suspended. The forensic accounting Vera had commissioned established that the savings account Boyd had been angling toward had in fact been co-managed by me under a written informal agreement with Reeve that met the threshold for equitable claim. The house was mine. It took another 4 months to get to the final paperwork. Legal things always take longer than you think they should. But the day Judge Osi Bonsu signed the order confirming the estate settlement, and I walked out of that building into a Tuesday afternoon in July, with the sun doing that particular Charlotte summer thing, where it's too bright and too hot, and the air smells like pavement and cut grass, I sat down on a bench outside the courthouse and I called Fern. She picked up on the first ring. She always does, I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very quietly, good, Sutton. I could hear her crying. First time in my adult life I've ever heard that. I'm not going to tell you I feel okay. That's not the honest version. I still wake up at 3 in the morning sometimes and reach for the other side of the bed. I still buy Thai food on Fridays and sit at the table where we used to eat it, and I eat it by myself, and it still catches me off guard every time. The way something can be almost unbearable and also somehow necessary, because the alternative is to stop doing the thing entirely, and I'm not willing to do that. What I will tell you is this. Reeve knew me well enough to know I could carry what he left me. He knew it before I did. He tucked that envelope under the blotter, and he wrote my name on it in his handwriting that slants to the left. And he trusted me to find it, and I did. And Boyd, who looked at me at my own wedding reception and said, "You got what you wanted." Boyd sat in a courtroom and watched me hold something he didn't know I was holding, and he looked me in the eye at the end of it, and I let him see that I was still here, exactly where I belonged. That was enough. When Fern drove up the following weekend, she brought her famous lemon icebox pie in a Tupperware container, and she walked through my front door, and stood in the hallway and looked around at everything the way you look at a place you're relieved still exists. And she set the pie down on the kitchen counter and turned to me and said, "You okay?" I thought about it, really thought about it. "I think I'm going to be," I said. She nodded. She went and got 2 forks, and we didn't use plates, and we stood there in my kitchen eating pie out of the container. And outside the window, the July afternoon kept doing what July afternoons do. And I thought about Reeve. And I thought about the envelope And I thought about how the things that are meant to survive us sometimes do, tucked under a blotter, in a handwriting that slants to the left, waiting for the right moment to matter. They thought I had nothing. Turns out I had exactly enough.